one home. And Linda Sumter has an announcement about our Centennial celebration, and every month we talk about a different decade of the church's life. So, Linda?
Good morning. Couldn't do it any earlier. We had so much celebration this month that there wasn't any room for the celebration, the 100. All right, so this month we're celebrating the 60s, and for many of us in here, that was our coming of age decade, right? Some of us weren't born, but most of us were. We had Dwight David Eisenhower in '60, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon were our presidents. Our governor, Edmund Pat Brown, and Ronald Reagan. So names you're going to start to be familiar with. The mayor, and if anybody knows the truth about this, I would love to know. Every resource I have says Edwin Wade was the mayor of Long Beach from 1960 to 1975. I can't find why he would do that. Our senators are also names that you would be familiar with: Pierre Salinger, George Murphy, Thomas Kuchel, and Alan Cranston. In 1960, Long Beach had 344,000 people, but it only increased 14,000 in the decade of the 60s. The Queen Mary arrived in 1967. Douglas Aircraft was a major employer, and in 1967 merged with McDonnell to start producing DC-8s and DC-9s. Aerospace employed thousands in Southern California in the 60s: North American Rockwell, Douglas, Lockheed, and Grumman. Grumman was the primary contractor for the Apollo lunar module, and these industries also supported numerous small businesses in the area, machine shops and transportation industry. In 1961, we put a monkey in orbit, and in 1969, a man walked on the moon. So Southern California had a big part in all of that. The music of that era was eclectic, I guess. Surf music in Southern California, you know, Dick Dale and the Deltones and the Ventures and the Beach Boys. Sinatra and his pals were still hanging around. Then we had the British invasion, the Beatles, the Stones, and a group called the Dave Clark Five. Dave Clark was the drummer. Right? We also had protest music, gospel music. There seemed to be something for everyone in that decade. The Vietnam War was raging, and we had the Watts riots. JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert F. Kennedy were all assassinated during the 60s. There were civil rights marches, but there were some really good things that happened in the 60s. A man by the name of Reynolds McCullough, who was a native Catalina, moved to Hawaii in the 50s, and he met a woman named Ruth Spooner, who knew how to sew surfer clothes. And in 1963, they introduced the Rain Spooner shirt that I'm sure some of you might have one on today, instead of the suit that what we wore in the 60s. So that is something that has stayed with us for 60 years. The first artificial heart was implanted in the 60s. The Thumbs Oil Islands, you all know about them. You know what Thumbs stands for? Texaco, Humboldt, Unocal, Mobile, and Shell. Now they're called the Astronaut Islands because there's Grissom, and they're named after the 4 astronauts. And in 1969, as I mentioned before, we had a moonwalk. At Bayshore, Reverend Gabrielson in 1960 turned 50 years old, and he had been here for 25 years. A parishioner described him as a broad-shouldered, dark-haired man who goes about the job of pastoring with the directness of a tank and the stamina of a channel swimmer. So those of you who don't know Milt, I suspect this is pretty much on target. He wrote a booklet called Beliefs Can Be Reasonable. His community marriage counseling was famous far and wide. If you were married in this church, you had to have 2 days of marriage counseling, or you didn't get to get married in this church. 18-hour days were his norm. He asked for and was granted a sabbatical leave early in the 60s, but they asked him to spread it out over 3 years. And as you heard last month, we went through 9 associate pastors in 8 years, so that might have contributed a little bit to the stress. We suffered some financial problems during the 60s. Al Watts, the treasurer, would often make requests at the beginning of the service for anybody who had their checkbook with them to please write a check today, or we wouldn't be able to make payroll. During Gabrielson's 25 years, there were 7 building campaigns, several remodels of the chapel, the first and second floor of the Sunday school wing, the youth center, and the sanctuary. We had no land left in Long Beach, so he managed to have somebody donate a land in Sky Forest. So we started building a cabin in Sky Forest up by Lake Arrowhead. It would take the entire decade to do this because he didn't want to incur debt. So as you got the money, you bought some plywood and you went up there and you put it up. And then you got some more money and you bought some pipes and you went up there and you put it up. So it took a while to do. In 1961, Gabrielson led the congregation to approve the merger between the Congregational Christian Churches and the Evangelical and Reformed Church, which became the United Church of Christ. This was an issue that had been going on for about 20 years, and there are still people that are strictly Congregationalists, did not join the United Church of Christ. We still are Congregationalists in our history, but we are UCC Church. In 1964, during the Civil Rights era, we declared ourselves open without regard to race, class, or ethnicity. Children never came into the sanctuary in the 60s. Elementary school children went to the youth center and had church service in the room adjacent to the kitchen. It's at the back of the building. And then they drew curtains across spaces to make Sunday school rooms. The junior high met in the current Sunday school rooms, and the preschool was in the space that's currently occupied by the administrative offices. The administrative offices were upstairs in the tower. High school had a young people's church, which worshiped in the evening. All Sunday school teachers had to come to the second service. That was Milt's. So you taught Sunday school for an hour, and then you came over here and sat for an hour. And in 1969, we obtained our first 2 sets of bells, and the bell group was member-led until 2000. The after-school program was still in place. 70 children a week came over here from Lowell Elementary School after school, and Louise Henry taught them about Jesus, taught them crafts, and they had games in the youth center. The parking lot, which we had had use of since 1954, was given to us exclusively in 1967. This is a story that will be continued because obviously we don't have exclusive use anymore. And all organizations have characters that impact the goals and outcomes. And I mentioned Al Watts earlier. He was one of the members of this church that served in various positions over the years. Besides being treasurer, he involved our church in a mission project providing Christmas gifts to Navajo children in Arizona. He helped with the Christmas workshop by cutting out pieces of wood that children assembled into magazine racks and reindeer and toothbrush holders. But he was also a match for Reverend Gabrielson. If Reverend Gabrielson's sermon was going too long, Al would simply take his watch off, hold it up, and he sat back there right about where Jennifer is sitting, And the response usually from Gabrielson was, "Yeah, I see you, Al, but I'm not done." So Al was not afraid to challenge three ministers that I know of, Gabrielson, Ken Coates, and Charlie Ensley. He's also was awarded the Silver Beaver Award by the Boy Scouts of America. It's the highest local honor for volunteers. He himself had been an Eagle Scout. Al remained a character here at Bayshore for many years, mentored three ministers, as I mentioned, and his legacy is part of our common history. So next month, we're going to celebrate the 70s. So I know some of you may have stories from the 70s. If so, please let me know. And we will be having a potluck after church on the 12th, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Not everybody remembers the Dave Clark 5, but you did, and it makes me glad all over. You know.
They were the second group from Britain to be on Ed Sullivan after the Beatles.
So, yeah, and every family that had a boy, their last name was Clark, one of them had to be David. So I have the most common name in the world, but I blame all my stuff on other people that way. So anyway, this is the Christmas